Hi guys, my name is Maria and this is my channel, Tea Books Magic, and today I wanted to do a discussion video about morally gray characters. I've been thinking a lot about this recently because I was talking to a friend about a book I was reading, and I kind of mentioned that I had a hard time with the book at first because I don't tend to love morally gray characters. They're not really a buzzword for me. I can like a book with them, but it's not something that I'm drawn to or I seek out specifically. And my friend's reaction kind of surprised me because what she said in response was that she only wants to read about morally gray characters because any other characters aren't nuanced or complex or relatable, and morally gray characters are. And that kind of took me by surprise because that's not how I define morally gray characters, and I think that characters who are morally gray can be all of those things, but then characters who are not morally gray or are more on the heroic side, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not those things either. So I was kind of thinking about it a lot, and I was reading a lot of articles, and I realized that there's kind of many different definitions about how people are applying the word morally gray when describing characters. It can be very broad, it can be very specific, it can kind of vary a lot, and so this is something that I've been kind of mulling over in my mind, and it's just been finding fascinating to think through and look at different character types. So I wanted to make a video talk about it. I haven't made any conclusive thoughts on what I do think the true definition is, so I'm really excited to hear what you all think, especially about how morally gray characters compare to anti-heroes, relatable characters, flawed characters. Are all those things facets of morally gray, or are they not always? So that's kind of what I'm posing as the question today. And I should mention that I will be talking about characters from certain books, a little bit of movies, TV, media. I'm going to do my best not to really spoil anything about the character other than just talking about kind of the type of character they are. So I'm not going to go into plot spoilers or anything like that, but just to let you know, I will be referencing them. You might have heard of some of them, might not have, read some of the books and not the others. It doesn't really matter. I'm just bringing them up as examples to kind of talk about different things. So I'll start off by reading kind of two different definitions I found online about morally gray characters. The first one says that the morally gray characters are the intermediate between a villain and a hero. They are neither wholly bad nor good, which is what makes them such interesting additions to a story. And then the other definition right underneath that, when I did the search, says that characters who are morally gray are often an anti-hero or anti-villain. Anything less than an ideal hero is gray. So I found that interesting because I agree with the first one. I do think that the way I kind of look at morally gray characters is that they straddle the line between hero and villain, between being inherently good and inherently bad. I think they are in that in-between area. But I don't agree with the second definition. I don't personally think that anything less than kind of the ideal classic hero type is a morally gray character. That for me feels like too broad of a definition, but maybe that's how other people apply it. So I'm curious kind of what your initial thoughts on that are. For example, my favorite book character of all time is Falcon Valmond from the Greatcoat series by Sebastian de Castell, the first book of which is Traitor's Blade. And Falcon is a very idealistic, honorable, righteous, justice-seeking character. I wouldn't call him a morally gray character. I don't think that he quite fits. I don't think he's what comes to mind when I think of a morally gray character. But he is very nuanced. He is flawed. For example, his idealism is often the thing that really blinds him and gets him into situations because he's not thinking clearly and he's just seeing what he wants to see. His friends point that out all the time. And he's got complexity, he makes wrong decisions, he's very nuanced. And there's a point at which in the series, the darker side of him kind of comes out a bit more. And I think that he's a very nuanced, complex character. But again, I don't think that he would necessarily be a morally gray character. And the main reason for that is because, like I said, he's kind of more of your heroic type. He is very justice seeking. He's part of this disgraced band of magistrates that used to serve the king. And the king was overthrown, but this band is still trying to kind of do what they can to piece this really corrupt land back together, trying to restore justice and kind of continue to serve the ideals that they put together with the king. And so again, for me, Falcon just wouldn't fit into that definition, but I would disagree with anyone who said that he wasn't complex or relatable. I think he's very relatable in the sense that he wants a better world when he's seeing corruption all around him and darkness all around him. I think that, in today's world, that's very relatable. And I think also that he's very relatable in the sense that he has flaws and he makes mistakes. Again, those for me, so I don't think that relatable and morally gray have to go hand in hand. I think that they can be together, but also doesn't, I think that heroic characters can be relatable. I think that in classic fantasy, we did originally have very black and white kind of hero villain, very one-dimensional characters in that way, because it was more about the plot and the themes. And I think that as we're getting away from that in modern fantasy, we are having characters that are a lot more nuanced, because that we're looking for better character arcs, we're looking for more character development, we're looking for relatable, interesting, complex characters, and we're not just wanting them to kind of serve as this stereotypical stand-in for the theme or the plot of the story. Which is not to say that all classic fantasy was that, but I think that classic fantasy did have a bit more of that kind of idealistic, one-dimensional hero. I think that's leading to a trend of getting more morally gray characters, but I think we're also getting much more nuanced, idealistic, heroic characters that are still relatable, still flawed, still complex. And those are some of my favorite characters to read about personally. Another interesting thing that I read in kind of different articles arguing about what morally gray characters are and what defines them was the point that morally gray characters have to have a moral code, and that's kind of what creates that morally gray, because they might be doing, you know, acts that aren't necessarily good acts, or they might be doing the right thing but for the wrong reasons, but they have a moral code that they also abide by. And what's interesting about that for me is that it kind of makes me wonder, at what point do they become the villain in our mind? Is it just from the perspective of the story? Is it as long as there's a bigger bad in the story that's the antagonist, we're okay with our morally gray character because they're not the worst in the story? Or is it that certain acts are not allowed, and if they did that we wouldn't forgive them and they would go into the villain mind? So you have to kind of walk the line between what's allowed. Like, for example, if they're killing a child or if they're committing genocide, all of a sudden, are those acts, do those put them straight into the villainous category in our mind? Or would, depending on how it's portrayed, and if we were given the justifications and kind of saw through the character's mind, would we still lump them into morally gray? And that's not something I have an answer on yet. I think it can depend from the author's perspective in the world, and I think part of what I love about fantasy is that you buy into the world and the morals that you're reading about, and so the morals are different than they would be in our world. For example, anyone in our world that killed someone would be a complete villain in my mind, you know? That's absolutely not okay. But in a story like, for example, Six of Crows, we buy into the fact that these are kids who have to commit heinous acts, but that they're just doing their best for themselves. They're having to stand up for themselves in a really, you know, dark, horrible world. But they do have a moral code that they also abide by. Take, for example, Kaz Brekker. He's someone that I would lump into the morally gray, you know, area. We follow him and he's a protagonist, and we get his justifications and his backstory, and so we feel for him, we sympathize with him. There's a lot of connection with him in Six of Crows, but he does awful things, and he does them a lot of times for his own gain or for his own personal reasons. And yes, there are, you know, different codes that he abides by. Like, for example, he doesn't traffic women and he's against prostitution, whereas there are other characters in the story that we don't necessarily follow as the main protagonists that would cross those moral lines. So it kind of helps give us a comparison there and kind of a line to divide things through. But then, for example, take Inej in Six of Crows. She's an assassin character, so she kills, but she has a moral code, and she has a religion and a faith that she also follows, and that dictates kind of her view of the world. But she also is doing what she needs to do in order to get by. And if you look at Kaz and Inej, for example, Kaz is much more of the morally gray, almost villainous character. I mean, arguably you could say he's a villain, and Inej is probably on the more redeemable side of the morally gray, but she is definitely committing morally gray acts, potentially villainous acts, if you kind of, depending on how you frame them. So it's an interesting contrast of, you know, we lump them all into morally gray, but there's different levels even within that. I also wanted to talk a little bit about characters that kind of don't have a choice or are put in situations where they do villainous things, but they're kind of not left with a choice. And again, arguably you could say that Kaz doesn't have a choice in Six of Crows because this is the world that he's born into, and he just has to find a way to survive in it. Debatable, but I think that, you know, that someone could argue that point. And then if you look at a character like, for example, Bucky Barnes from Marvel, Bucky's whole storyline is that he was a heroic character, and he's kind of put in a position where he has to serve the villainous side, and he's not given personal choice. In fact, his self-will is essentially taken away. And so he can't really be described as a heroic character anymore, although I think that, you know, who he is at his soul is very heroic. But he has committed acts through being controlled by others that put him in that morally gray sphere for me. But he's not a villain because, on the other hand, like we talked about, he's not actively choosing to do those acts. So he's a great morally gray example for me. There's also a character in the Inheritance Cycle by Christopher Paolini, in the first book of which is Aragon, that has a similar kind of trajectory to Bucky, in my opinion, where they end up having to do awful things in service of the evil side, but they also don't have much of a choice. And so it again puts them kind of in that in-between sphere where they're not heroic and they're not villainous, but they're morally gray. So kind of the different examples that I've already talked about, they are all flawed and they are all complex and nuanced. But again, going back to like Falcio, I don't think that only morally gray characters can be flawed, nuanced, or complex. I think that you can do a really great job of writing a heroic or a villainous character even that are those things as well. I'm going to go into another example, which is the Daevabad trilogy by S.A. Chakraborty, one of my absolute favorite series, first book of which is City of Brass. And there's a character in there, Dara, who I would say straddles the line between morally gray and even villainous. I don't really know what category I would lump him into, because I think the author was very careful about making sure that even though we connected to this character, it was clear that they were never condoning his actions and that he was doing awful things. And more importantly, that he was aware of it and he knew what he was doing and he was doing it anyway for his own reasons. And I think what makes him so fascinating to read about is that we do on some degree sympathize with him and understand where he's coming from, but don't agree with his actions. And I think he very much could be someone who might even be on the villainous side, for example, that is just complex villain, because he's not the villain of the story, he's not the antagonist, but at the same time, the things he does are horrific and not easily redeemable. And that's made very clear in the story. And so he's kind of what I would put forward as an example of a character that is complex and nuanced, but I don't know if I would necessarily label them as morally gray. I think that maybe that's too broad. I think, like I said, he's maybe more on the dark side of things. Don't get me wrong though, I do love following Dara. Then there's characters that I think are just, hopefully everyone can agree, are villainous, evil, fall into that line. Like for example, Joe from You. I believe his name is Joe. I couldn't watch past the first episode, so if I'm wrong, sorry. But I don't think you could argue that he's morally gray. Maybe you can. If you can, let me know why you would think so. I think he's pretty firmly in the like evil, dark category. Although arguably he thinks he has his own moral code that he follows and he kind of justifies his actions to himself. But I think it's kind of almost the perspective of that the author is taking to some degree, or the film creator, because I feel like we're not meant to like Joe, or at least I couldn't stand him. It's almost like the author is helping us decide what category to put someone into. And I also think it kind of goes back to another article that I read where they said that there has to be a bigger bad in the story in order for those characters to not be the villain. Otherwise, they kind of are the antagonist and the villain that we're fighting against, just by nature of it. And so like in You, I think that Joe is kind of the main antagonist, even though he's also kind of the main character. So I think maybe that's partly why I put him into that category. But I did see an article that thought that he was morally gray, and that really shocked me because I don't see how that would make sense. There's two fantasy series that I haven't read that everyone usually talks about as far as morally gray characters go. For example, First Law by Joe Abercrombie. I have not read First Law yet, and I'm very curious to. Like I said, one of the reasons that I wasn't initially drawn to and was kind of hesitant about it at first is because it's touted as having morally gray characters, and for me, they have to be done well. I have to find them likable to some degree, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but for me, a story with morally gray characters, that's not a drawing point. So I do want to read the series just because I'm now very curious to see another kind of example of all this, but I don't know that it's going to be for me, despite it being said that Joe Abercrombie writes kind of some of the best characters in fantasy, and I'm such a character reader, so maybe it is for me. We'll see. I'm kind of curious about that one. And then the other series is the Poppy War trilogy, which I also have not read and also am on the fence about. I'm leaning towards not reading the Poppy War, but reading First Law, like I said, and I think the biggest reason there for me is that with the Poppy War, everyone talks about how Rin is not a likable character, and a lot of people enjoy that about the series, but I need to have a likable protagonist. I need to like at least something about the characters that I'm following, whereas with the First Law, I've heard that you do like the characters and you root for them, even though you can tell that they are not doing the right thing, they're not good characters, they are gray or flawed or even potentially on the villainous side of things, but you root for them. And that's something where that for me kind of is the make it or break it with morally gray characters. Like I mentioned earlier, for me it's about likability to some degree. And that's different than relatability. It's not that I have to relate to the character, I just have to connect to them. And I think that that's something in the way that the author writes it, where I have to see into their emotions, their beliefs, their thoughts enough to understand them and to get behind them. Otherwise, I spend the whole book hating them and I don't want to be reading it. That's not a pleasant experience for me. Unless there are other characters that I can be attached to, and then I'm kind of just like hating one as I go along in the story, that can work sometimes. But if I'm hating the main characters, I don't care about their story, I don't care about whether or not they succeed, and I'm not involved or connected in any way. And that can cause me to DNF a book or a series entirely. And it's not because they're doing acts that are not heroic, it's because I haven't been given enough of a emotional connection to them, or enough for me to be able to understand their kind of thoughts, beliefs, and why they're doing what they're doing, and to feel for them. I think that that's what's important to me. And sometimes with heroic characters, that's a little bit easier because they're just more likable to me. They're characters that I can see that they're trying to do the right thing, and whether or not they always succeed, they usually make mistakes, they fail along the way. Sometimes the right thing turns out to be the wrong thing and they didn't realize that. But the thing that really connects me to heroic characters oftentimes is that they're trying to do their best. And that's something that I can really kind of connect to them on that level. And so just for me personally, something like the Poppy War, where people say that Rin isn't someone that you like, but she's someone that has a fascinating character journey, I'm kind of torn on whether or not that's a book that I'll want to try. But it hasn't been one that has me excited about it, if that makes sense, because it almost sounds like that's a book that's more plot and thematic based than like character. Not to say that her character isn't well written, I'm sure it is. It's just more that maybe the whole reason that people like that series is the plot and the themes, and kind of watching her journey and it's kind of the same thing as like when people like reading a villain origin story or something like that, where characters descend into evil or descend into like the dark side, or they kind of go dark. That's not a journey that I'm just as interested in personally, but I can see why it would appeal to others. Okay, so we've already talked about how I think that nuanced, complex, and flawed characters aren't limited strictly to morally gray characters, and we've talked about how relatability and likability are different for me as well. Another question that I kind of wanted to bring up was, is a morally gray character defined by their acts or by their intentions? Do we lump people into morally gray or villainous or heroic based on what they do, or based on what we're given knowledge of their kind of justifications, beliefs, backstory? Do you see morally gray characters as someone like, okay, he did this act, therefore he's in this category? Or do you see it as, he did this act, but I know why he did it and the backstory of it, and therefore I can be more forgiving toward it and will lump it into this morally gray middle category? And I think that that's tough, because sometimes villains can be written in a way where we can see clearly that they believe in what they're doing, but it's still wrong. And so that's kind of where an author can write a really good character, but we're still judging them based on what they're doing, despite why they believe they're doing it. But then it's a question of, I guess, is it based on how well the author writes them and whose perspective the story's being told from? Because I recently, for example, finished Jade War, which is the second book of the Greenbone Saga by Fonda Lee, and loved this book. 5 stars, absolutely incredible. I'll talk about it in my wrap-up. But in Jade War, and I won't go into specifics because it is the second book in the series, in Jade War, one of the characters, Hilo, who you may have heard mentioned as kind of the one who is then that morally gray, kind of undefinable state. People usually mention him as kind of a love it or hate it character. There's one thing he does when someone tells him no to something that he is proposing that is awful, and I think kind of inexcusable. But he does it based on his moral principles. And throughout the rest of the book, I still connected to and liked Hilo. That wasn't the final straw for me in not liking him, but I do think that at what point do you stop being morally gray and become more of a villain type? And I think that maybe that act that he did in book 2, he's right on the line there for me. And it's an interesting book series too, because we don't really have just a clearly defined antagonist villain. We have kind of someone who's in opposition, but I wouldn't define them as the evil villain of the series. And so you kind of then have to think, are the characters that we're following despite us liking them and their story and connecting to them, are they the real villains at the heart of the story? So again, I think that all of this is so subjective and so ill-defined, and that's kind of why I've been so fascinated by it recently and wanted to even talk about this in the first place. I've rambled a lot and brought up kind of various examples. Some you may know, some you may not. Hopefully there were some kernels in there that you kind of found interesting and that got you thinking. Like I said, I haven't really reached a decisive definition for myself as far as morally gray characters go, other than the fact that I don't think that any character that is flawed, nuanced, complex equals morally gray. I think that those two things can be separate or together. Other than that, I think that I kind of am still in the questioning phase of kind of, are you morally gray character or are you not? Are you a villainous character that we're just kind of following and relate to? So this video is mostly just me airing my thoughts out and kind of things that I've been mulling over and questions I've been posing to myself, rather than an argument in either direction. I'm super curious what you all think and how you define morally gray characters in the past, or examples of characters that you would put in any of the categories as far as good, morally gray, evil goes. If you agree or disagree with any of the ones that I mentioned, or if you have any kind of further thoughts on those, please let me know down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all have a lovely day.